Hello, my name is Matt Baird, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. I am a senior at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and today I'm going to be sharing a presentation with you about queerness in ancient times. Again, thank you so much for joining me. Before we get started, I do just want to share a brief content warning and statement of inclusivity with you. Um, so in terms of the content, I just want everyone to be aware that this presentation will mention sex, and it's really meant for more mature audiences. So put in headphones if you need to. Also wanted to let you know that there are some mentions of homophobia, so just keep that in mind as well. Um, Also just wanted to share that we are studying very specific parts of ancient history, and none of us will ever be able to be complete experts on what did or did not happen in antiquity because we are just people studying it. We don't actually have that firsthand experience to be able to know that. So just kind of keep in mind that we're just being scholars here. We don't necessarily know all of the information. That's not necessarily the point either. Um, Now, I would love to just define the word queer um, right off the bat, as that word is going to be used quite a bit throughout this presentation. Um, so queer is a word, according to the dictionary, that means, odd or unusual. And, it often has a negative connotation, but it really doesn't have to. For the purpose of our work today, when we use the word queer, we are referring to the idea that we're referring to a person that their sexuality or gender does not necessarily conform with what the stereotypical definition of what's normal is. And we would love to have a discussion about the word normal at the end of the presentation. Absolutely. Um, so in terms of just an overview of our presentation today, I do just want to acknowledge that um, generally the order in which we study ancient civilizations is Egypt and the Near East, then Greece, then Rome, um, just based on, the timeline and kind of how events occurred, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Um, but I have the most to say about Greece, so we're going to be doing that last. I am just going to get us started with a general ancient civilizations overview, and then we'll move into like the queer aspects of each different group, and then we'll finish off with some discussion questions. Throughout this, please feel free to leave comments in the chat, questions, or just unmute. Let me know what any of your questions are. I'm happy to take those right at any time, or at the end. And I do want to just say right off the bat, there's a good chance that I won't be able to answer one or more of your questions because I certainly do not know all. Okay, so jumping right in. I first would love to just define the word ancient for us. So generally, when we say the word ancient, we're referring to the time period 8000 BCE to 476 CE. Now, for those of you who don't know, BCE is before Common Era and CE is Common Era. So like right now, we're in 2021 Common Era. And so if we went backwards from 2021 to 0, that's where the count for BCE would start. So like we would go backwards and then eventually we get to 8000 BCE, pardon me, which is generally what we refer to as the beginning of the ancient time period. And the reason around 8000, that's not arbitrary. We generally say that because that is, that's when we saw the onset of massive use of writing, formalized language, and really, development of urban centers within societies. Just kind of, we also saw a rise in the use of agriculture rather than just hunting gathering. So kind of more structure within societies. And then we kind of cap it off right around 476 Common Era, because that is generally whenever we saw the downfall of the United Roman Empire, which just kind of marks the end of the ancient world. And we'll absolutely talk more about that as we can continue going along. So just moving right along, kind of doing a definition of civilization now. So there are some different elements that a place, a group needs in order to be really considered a civilization, according to a lot of key scholars in this area. And the first one is a written language or some form of record. And on top of that, generally, we would also need, a religion or some sort of structured spirituality that is kind of shared among the people. And that's not to say that everyone needs to share this religion. It's merely saying that, that kind of opportunity for unity around spirituality exists. Thirdly, some sort of government or political organization. And on top of that, some form of infrastructure and public works. We would also need, a social hierarchy of some sorts, some sort of classes, and urban centers as well, which really kind of have, are the center of power and culture within societies. And finally, division of labor, economic roles. So I am absolutely open to, discussing this. This isn't even necessarily a construct that I completely agree with. I think that it is possible to have a civilization with which is lacking one or more of these things, but can still be considered a civilization. But generally, this is what a lot of really key scholars have defined as a civilization. And when you put this all together, we're then able to say that a civilization is a human organization for the advancement of the standard of living. So this right here is just a timeline of Greek history. Don't really take too much, worry too much about, kind of taking all of that in. Really, the point of me showing you this is just to kind of illustrate that Greek history is kind of divided into different ages. Today, we're mainly going to be focusing on the classical age, which took place from 500 to 323 BCE, but we obviously will be touching on some of the other time periods as well. So now I'm just going to give you a little bit more background information about Greece. So within Greece, we have Sparta, which was really one of the earliest poli, and it was known for its military powers. And it was really, really important and powerful throughout the Archaic and Classic ages, through some different wars, and they were really an icon of militarism and warfare. And then Athens. So Athens really comes to kind of represent Greece, period, as time goes on. And one of the specific places that you might have seen in movies or heard of before is the Acropolis. And this was a fortress and military base during the Neolithic period, one of those periods in the timeline there, that was used primarily because of the position of it, just overlooking everything and kind of just having a good view. And then also the Parthenon, which was the center of religious life in Athens, and was also the headquarters for the Delian League, which was a military kind of alliance between different states. So yeah, in long story short, Athens really does just kind of come to be the symbol of Greece as a whole over time. And yeah, so Athens will eventually fall in the Peloponnesian War, which is fought against Sparta, the other state that we just heard about. And finally, just a very brief overview of Rome. This is just a timeline of Roman history right here, how it's usually split up. Um, you know, Rome is really kind of a filter through which we can examine the whole ancient world, because Rome really kind of takes everything from Greece and Rome and everywhere else and just kind of puts it together into this package um, that, just kind of really beautifully combines everything. It's really kind of the best of all cultures put together. Um, so with that, we're going to move on to the even more exciting stuff. We're going to start talking about the queer Near East and Egypt. So the oldest human cultures that are complex enough to be called civilizations, kind of according to that construct that we talked about in the beginning, seem to have emerged in ancient Iraq, Turkey, and in Egypt. Um, and so, despite the immense time that is kind of covered between now and the beginning of antiquity, um, research into queer life and into just homosexuality in general really seems to have only just begun for these areas. So, kind of getting us started off with one specific example, and we won't be able to see as many specific examples as I would like, just because of what I just mentioned a moment ago about this study just kind of beginning. Um, but one of the main examples that we point to when we're talking about Egypt and the Near East is that of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep. So these two were they were two men, and they died at some point around 2380 BCE. And in 1964, Common Era, so pretty recently, archaeologists in Egypt opened a tomb and found these two together as pictured in the images. Obviously, these are pieces of art, but you get the point. Um, and inside the tomb, these archaeologists really discovered what may be the oldest evidence of queer lives in existence. So in the two were depicted in stereotypical ways that heterosexual couples were shown in Egyptian funeral art. So, kissing nose to nose, holding hands, and, just being very close together, almost in an embrace. It's very clear that just based on other history, that if a man and a woman were depicted in this way, they obviously would have been interpreted as a couple. Um, and what's really interesting to think about is, even with all of this evidence, these archaeologists that first found them, really, what they said is they said they are really, really close brothers, possibly even twins, um, which is very interesting. Now we're just going to talk a little bit about, the phrase queer Egyptians, or this also would go for if you were to say queer Greeks or queer Romans. So this isn't really historically accurate. And that is because in antiquity, um, homosexuality and queerness were generally more aspects of coming of age and military training. They weren't necessarily romantic. It wasn't necessarily an identity point. It was more just kind of something that was normal and that happened all the time within like a majority or a lot of the population, if not the majority. Um, Nowadays, it's very different, for better, for worse. And so yeah, it's just not historically accurate to say, queer Egyptians or Greeks or Romans. So that's kind of why we just steer clear of that. The next thing that we're going to talk about is just this spell here. So no need to read over all of this unless you want to. I will be sharing the slides afterwards. But basically what this is a Coptic spell. and in Christian Egypt or Coptic Egypt, um, there were these spells, these languages that were kind of, held to a really high standard. People believed in these. And what this spell specifically did was it was written for a man to obtain another male as a lover. Um, and we find this just very interesting because this spell is again just evidence of queer life in antiquity, or as what we would think of as queer life, because we've established that that's not necessarily the most historically accurate thing to say. um so yeah, I just thought that the spell was pretty interesting, kind of like a different look rather than just like archaeological evidence. So yeah, moving right along, we're now going to talk about queer Rome. So here, I'm just going to tell you, this is actually a picture of a Roman prison. And so something that was pretty interesting that I found in my research was that imprisonment for debt was actually ended in Rome as the result of a homosexual affair. So somewhere between 400 and 300 BCE, is when men ceased to be imprisoned for debt. And the change in law was occurred because there was a debtor, basically, and this person that was in debt was young and was considered very beautiful. And the collector was really taken in by that. And in a lot of different readings, it said that the young man inflamed the collector's heart to lust and really desire. Um, so kind of thinking more about this. The boy, they had sex. It's safe to assume, and basically the boy ended up later, kind of crying out, and saying that he had undergone a very shameful wrong. Maybe there was some sort of lack of consent, some sort of kind of blackmail, and um, so looking through today's lens, it's obviously very troubling. And I do just want to point out that this wasn't necessarily something that anyone in society really saw a problem with in ancient Rome, which is obviously not good, but it's just worth noting as we kind of study this. So anyways, people brought forth a proposal, um, long story short, that people should not be put in prison for debt anymore. And it went through. And it was all provoked by a homosexual affair. Um, so, yeah. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Suetonius. So, Suetonius was a historian, and his most important surviving work is a set of biographies of 12 rulers from Rome. And so we're going to talk about a couple of these rulers. The first one that we're going to talk about is Nero. And again, don't feel like you need to read all of this information on the slide right now. I've actually highlighted what's most important for our purposes. But basically, it's Nero, the most interesting part out of the biography that suggests homosexuality is really when again, the highlighted portion here is what we're looking at. It's definitely quite troubling, but it is interesting, and it's evidence of queer life in ancient times. And the part that's most thought-provoking for me is when it says that Nero found this boy Sprouse and tried to make a woman of him, and he married him with all of the usual ceremonies that would have occurred if a man was marrying a woman. And then he treated him as his wife. And I found that very interesting. And also, we will have time later to kind of examine the origin of treating someone as a wife. Like, what does that really mean? So yeah, we'll have more time to speak about that. The next person that I would like to talk about with you is Galba. So in his biography, it was really said that he was inclined to unnatural desire, and in gratifying it he preferred full-grown strong men. So that's basically just suggesting that he preferred to have sex with men. And that again is just evidence of queer existence in ancient times. And he sometimes was criticized for that in society, but it definitely was largely considered a pretty normal thing. Now we're going to talk about Otho. So I am very interested in Otho. One of the first things that I noticed in this biography is that he's described as being almost feminine in his care of person, and that he had the hair of his body plucked out, and that was just kind of surprising to people in his society, since he was born as a male. Yet he was feminine in his care of person. It's interesting just to kind of think about, why is it feminine? Like, where does that all come from? The next piece that we're going to talk about is Alexander the Great and Hephaestion. So basically, there are some documents that kind of give an account of Alexander's life, which make his intimacy with Hephaestion very clear. And as you can see in this image right here, this is someone bowing to the two of them together. And basically, yeah, it's just that there's a lot of evidence of them kind of being together in different historical documents, and that again is pretty interesting. So moving on to queer Greece, even though that again might not be historically accurate to say. So for modern queer people and some intellectuals, ancient Greece has long functioned as a sort of homosexual paradise. Greek culture was and is really highly privileged as one of the foundations of Western culture. And the culture of sexuality is really apparent in the literature of ancient Greece. And really, it was quite different from the repression which is experienced by modern queer people. So really, it would be a bit too simple to just kind of view Greek homosexuality as a more ideological version over its modern versions, because as scholars have studied all of this more and more, they're really coming to believe that the term queer or homosexual referring to, say, sexual orientation isn't fit to refer to Greek sexual worlds. And this is, similar to what we mentioned with Egypt near the beginning of the presentation. Rather, they kind of stress, just fluidity, and that being very embraced within Greek sexual worlds. Rather, they just kind of stressed a lot of active and passive roles, and again, just kind of the way that it was looked at is just very different to how it's looked at today. So yeah, it's basically not really possible to portray Greece as a homosexual paradise. That just wouldn't be accurate. Um, okay, so just kind of introducing a little bit more about homosexuality in Greece. So it was definitely celebrated and accepted, but it was certainly not universal. Like a large portion of people participated in homosexual acts, but it definitely wasn't universal. Um, Really, homosexuality was seen as a coming of age by most people, and what that means is it's referring to the concept of pederasty. And so basically, this was the structured practice of male homosexual relationships for mostly upper class men between an older and dominant partner, which was known as the erastes, and a younger and passive partner, known as the eromenos. So the younger boys were the eromenos were publicly courted and given gifts, and the relationship was generally educational in terms of them learning about morality, loyalty, war, and there was also an erotic aspect. And generally, these relationships did end when the youth came of marriageable age, and then they got married to women. Um, so this is generally most of what we see when doing reading. Most Greek literature kind of portrays homosexuality in this exact light that I've just laid out for you. Um, so that's very true that that did occur, but that's certainly not all. Um, Now we're just going to talk a little bit about the philosophical view, contemporaneous philosophical view of homosexuality in Greece. So Plato, who it was one of the most influential philosophers ever, um, in Symposium on the left, he's really seen as kind of seeing Eros, who was the god of love in Greece, as fundamentally homosexual. Um, and then in the laws, he kind of adopted a more negative view. He recommends that homosexuality is really just a form of adultery, and that it is not to be engaged in any case. And if it is engaged in, it's really meant to be kept private or closeted, and that if it's discovered, it is to be punished by deprivation of civil rights and some other form of severe penalty. And so these two very conflicting ideas have raised a lot of questions among scholars. You know, was there something lost in translation? Or, you know, just what was it? And that's kind of interesting to think about as well. Um, Here we're looking at Achilles and Patroclus. So these two were represented in a lot of the Iliad by Homer. And so Homer doesn't really present them as homosexually involved together, but later Greeks assumed that they were. This kind of connects to the tomb of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep that we talked about at the beginning. Um, you know, some sort of maybe erasure, lack of awareness around these topics. We're not totally sure, but you know, it's just interesting to think about why was it not mentioned? And I think there are different reasons why, and I don't think they're all problematic. Um, so this poem here is really one of the only pieces of evidence that we have for lesbian love in antiquity. So this was written by Sappho, and as we can see on some of the highlighted portions, and really on the bottom of the second portion right here, where my cursor is. So it's poetic, but generally it's interpreted as Sappho kind of describing another woman and lusting after her. And this is kind of one of the best pieces of evidence that we have for lesbian love in antiquity. Um, and we will definitely talk more about the significance of that being, one of the strongest pieces of evidence, and it's a piece of poetry. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about Aristophanes. In the photo here, this is just a scene from Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds, and it's Socrates, one other who came just before Plato, another very influential philosopher. Um, so some historians and archaeologists interpret Aristophanes' works as overtly homophobic, and others kind of go with the idea that Aristophanes really just hated everyone. We do not have time to like break out different pieces of the poems, but and not the poems, sorry, the books, but and the plays, but it's really up for interpretation, honestly. Thinking a little bit about Theocritus, he was a Sicilian poet and just really influential in the ancient Greek poetry world. In this poem here, again, we don't have enough time to go over all of the specific pieces, but this poem is kind of describing a homosexual kissing contest that took place between some young people. And I just found that pretty amusing, honestly. So yeah. Um, in this is a legal brief that was delivered by Astrones against a political opponent, and it was really talking a lot about Greek attitudes to homosexuality. And in the bottom portion, especially here, it just is kind of explaining, people need to kind of conform to the pederasty concept that has been laid out in society. People are not really shouldn't really be, diverting from that. A couple of really influential people that long-term couples, people that we would love to just mention are Aristes and Pleiades. And basically, they're just kind of a symbol within Greece of lifelong love. We also have Damon and Pythias. So there are different versions of the tale, but the best known is when one of them was basically condemned to death, and then the other kind of came to the rescue of the other and was like, if they're gonna die, if he's gonna die, I'm gonna die. And then they end up inspiring Dionysus, the person that is in charge, so much that they're both released. We have Aristion and Hermodius, and they were cited with overthrowing tyranny together in Athens. And finally, Pausanias and Agathon. Agathon was an Athenian dramatist, and he was described as a very effeminate homosexual. It was in his house that the dinner party of Plato's Symposium took place. And there's just so much to talk about with Agathon. And that is an example of, pederasty that maybe lasted a lifetime. I know that was all so much information. I really do appreciate you coming to this presentation. So I do have just a couple of questions and discussion points just to kind of ponder over. If you are watching this through the YouTube link, feel free to just kind of pause in between each question. I'm just going to slowly click through the different slides and put on a little bit of music just while you ponder those questions. But please do feel free to reach out to me with any questions. If you are seeing this online, my contact information will be available. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you so much.